Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild supplement Mirrodin's Guide to Faerie, designed by Colin Kalin and Garth Herbert for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shout out to Platinum patrons Andrew, Brian, Richard, and Joe, and Gold patrons RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcos David Vicente Gilberto, Sean, aka Cert2B, and Adam. Thank you all very much for your support. Fairies are a fun thing to explore with D&D. Weirdly, we haven't gotten an official fairy adventure or guidebook with D&D. We've done Ravenloft, we've done the Sword Coast to Death. There's a lot of themes that I'm really looking forward to for published adventures. I would really like some kind of Arabian Nights type, like a desert theme. I still think there's a good pirate theme waiting to be explored, and of course something that would be with the Feywild. In the meantime, we have the DM's Guild. I actually previously reviewed another fairy-themed supplement called the Children of the Fae. It's a couple months ago, which was enjoyable and included mainly just player races as well as monster stat blocks based on those player races. Mirrodin's Guide to Faerie is much more of an all-encompassing, almost a Xanathar's Guide style booklet of just everything fairy. So it's got NPCs in terms of their detailed information, their relationships, the structure of the fairy courts. This is the summer and winter fairy courts, I believe, the Seelie and Unseelie as well as their stat blocks, of course. You've got several player races. You've got one new, I think one of my I have two subclasses, but subclasses for every single class that are, of course, fairy themed, as well as fairy themed magical items. So it really includes a little bit of everything, specifically more geared towards players rather than DMs necessarily. Obviously, the monster stat blocks and the actual fairy information is very much for DMs, but it's always a difficult thing to make a product like this because so much of what is going to be used in this product is going to be for players and not for DMs. That doesn't necessarily make it a bad product, but it's just something to be aware of if you're only a DM, on the DM's Guild looking for products. This one has a lot of stuff for players specifically. It's over 40 pages long and really includes a whole lot of information, although in being an all-encompassing supplement, it might not have enough of any one of those things that you're looking for. And for me specifically, at least compared to the Children of the Fae supplement, not nearly enough player races. I was really hoping to get some more cool player races because the ones that are included here are very well done. They feel very well balanced in that none of them are too crazy powerful. A big tendency when you're making your own player race is to just give it all kinds of cool special abilities and basically turn it into a superhero from level 1. Whereas I think that it does a good job here of really making it in line with the player's handbook races. So like you've got a few skill proficiencies and maybe one or two good spells you can cast, like Per Long Rest, and these kind of very specific things that are still very thematic. Like the Leprechaun can sense treasure hoards from far away. The Herkine. There actually is a pronunciation guide at the end, which is nice. The Satyr, basically, the Satyrs. Have a pan flute that they can cast, like sleep spells or charm spells from, just in innate spell casting, which is very, very thematic and nice. So I do like the races that are included here. I would have almost preferred to have just more of that because I really liked those races. The Hamadryad are basically just dryads, and then the Selkie are, I thought they were initially mermaids, but they are shape-shifting seals. Now, I'm not too up on my fairy lore, especially compared to the authors here, because they are very much well-versed in all manner of fairy lore. And so apparently that's a thing, shape-shifting seals that seem to follow the same myth of the mermaids, which is creatures of the sea that kind of can fall in love with humans and then eventually kind of return to the sea, and it's all unrequited love and stuff. A lot of fairy tales are love, lorn, and war. It's a lot of war. A lot of Irish mythology is is just war shit, which that's a lot of people's mythology, I suppose. But I really did like the attention to detail here in describing the fairy courts, which is drawn from previous editions of D&D, as well as like just classic mythology from our world. So like a lot of stuff from the King Arthur myths have to do with fairy shit. And William Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream is obviously all about fairy shit. So all of these different myths, and like all of Irish mythology, a lot of that is, Cuchulainn and all that shit is, a lot of the fairy terms are from our Celtic words. So all of that is really well done, and it really speaks to the fact these authors really know what they're talking about. And I learned a lot just by reading it. And it's a fun read. It's done in that style of, like a Xanathar's or Mordenkainen's, where it's written from the perspective of an actual character. Obviously, this one is Myrddin. I didn't feel like I necessarily knew who Myrddin was. He just seemed kind of like a generic, scholar, hero, adventurer. But it's still written in like, word of advice. Be polite, don't disturb a fairy ring, accept no favors, you can avoid it. It's got a little bit more flavor that helps it not be so dry. And then the ones that are actually done outside of that, character point of view are done in these green boxes, which are, the OOC, the out of character stuff, and it points you to like additional literature that you can read, and any specific inspirations of different magical items or characters, where they're drawn from. There's a whole list of things about the Winter Queen, or what do they call it, the Queen of Air and Darkness, which is actually shrouded in mystery in terms of who she actually is, and the authors provide a number of different solutions for who that could be. There's a fun bit of, there's this one character who's literally Santa Claus. Apparently Santa Claus lives in the Feywild within this universe, called the Winter Wizard, and is drawn on a Frank L. Baum book, which I believe is the Wizard of Oz author who wrote a string of those series books, and apparently wrote one about the life and adventures of Santa Claus. I was not aware of that, so that's pretty amazing. Just a really fun section. I kind of almost wish this section was a little longer too, but again, in being in kind of all-encompassing supplement, it kind of has just enough of each section, but makes me, because I enjoyed it so much, it makes me want each one to be just a little bit longer. In this case, I feel like the weakest section is unfortunately the longest, which is the subclasses section. It's here that I feel like, again, that's only useful for players, which is fine. You certainly have player supplements in there. But the one aspect where I feel like we actually do have Fey-related stuff that works well in the player's handbook is the subclasses. Like, there is a straight-up Warlock of the Archfey who has a fairy patron, which, all of that works already pretty well and is thematically tied to the Feywild and fairies. Paladins have, forget what it is offhand, like the Green Knight or something, where they essentially have their divine deity as an archfey. So there's already some, fairy-themed shit in the player's handbook already, and the authors acknowledge that and instead just kind of like replace certain things that already work well, which tells me that just some of the subclasses just aren't quite as interesting as others. I'm actually going through the races right here, which I already mentioned. They're really well done, probably one of my favorite aspects. I just like, I like new races in general. I think that's a really fun aspect here. And there's a lot of really fun fairy-style creatures that could make good player races, could make interesting player races, like dryads, essentially just tree people. I like the concept of having an Ashborn, which is a cool way of saying a dryad who's lost their tree. They have a constitution score increase. They know the Shillelagh cantrip and then bark spell. All of that makes sense without being too overpowering. The Satyr is probably my favorite in terms of the actual abilities they get, which is an immortal liver, advantage on saving throws against ingested or inhaled poisons and intoxicants, as well as the Reveler's Pipes, which they have those magical pan pipes they can play to cast either Charm Person or Sleep as a first level spell once per short or long rest. That's just very, very thematic, and I like that quite a bit. But if we go down to the subclasses, there is one, at least one for each. I think like rogues get two for some reason. But everybody's got at least one subclass, which is, very much how Xanathar's works. Xanathar's has even more per subclass. Some of them just work a lot better than others. The ones that didn't have a fairy theme already, I think they are given some good fairy themes. Barbarian is one of the good ones in that it just reflavors the totem warrior. It doesn't try to create a whole new barbarian one. It just gives them different totems based on fairy creatures, which the most common kind of low CR. I don't actually remember what a Displacer Beast is, but a Blink Dog and Displacer Beast are both fairy, Feywild creatures. And the Blink Dog, if you take that as your totem, you can fucking teleport around the battlefield while raging, which is amazing. And feels very, very cool and fun. The Displacer Beast also has the Displacer ability to essentially create an illusion like you were standing there, which translates to use a reaction to impose disadvantage on an attacker's attack roll. Both of those work very, very well. Others are okay. The Bard College of Binding. Again, I feel like Xanathar's already added like some good. They had the Bard College of Glamour or something that would already fit a fairy themed very well. So the Binding one is just about binding extraplanar creatures. That's okay. The Cleric one about Revelry. Again, clerics already have certain domains that would probably fit with fairy. So this one is maybe not, like healing would certainly fit with a fairy theme, so not quite as useful there. Druid Circle of Land is just, again, it takes, it's like the Barbarian one, it already takes a subclass in the player's handbook and just kind of slightly rethemes it. So it's disappointing in the way that they're not super exciting new subclasses, but they also feel like they are very well balanced. So that's kind of the flip of the coin. It doesn't like break things apart too much or create a whole bunch of like fiddly new abilities or anything. It just kind of reflavors a lot of the spells and things. One of the more interesting ones that does change things quite a bit, the Fighter Archetype Planar Vanguard, turns them into a fucking teleporting monstrosity. They can place an arcane mark on an opponent, which lets them teleport to them if they move away. At 10th level, they can just blink to foes with abandon, just teleporting up to 30 feet as a bonus action, essentially giving them Misty Step as an at-will ability, which is kind of crazy. Feels very cool, and also it's interesting how the Feywild is themed, not necessarily as just obvious fairy stuff, but also as the fact that there's this extra dimensional area that tends to overlap very commonly with our world. It's actually very easy to slip into, or our world I say, this is obviously the D&D world, but it is very easy to slip into that world. They tend to overlap quite a bit. Anywhere there's like verdant nature shit going on, you can slip into the Feywild. So I like the fact that there's a lot of planar movement stuff, and that's also one of the rogue archetypes, I believe, as well, is just the planar tunnel, what do they call it? Plane hopper, so you can just kind of teleport around. And there are, of course, notes about outside of that that help you explain, hey, if your campaign doesn't have a lot of extra planar travel, then this one's probably not that useful. The Paladin one is boring. Again, you've already got a good Archfey, or whatever the Green Knight Paladin one is. That works fine. This one is specifically tied to the courts, which is fine. The Ranger one is odd. The authors actually mentioned the fact that the Ranger is kind of a mess in the base game, and I don't know if Wizards actually ever confirmed that they were redoing the Ranger. I know that it was given an Unearthed Arcana. Someone can probably tell me in the comments. I don't know off the top of my head if that ever actually got if the Ranger actually got a patch to bring it a little up in power, because it was basically underpowered compared to other classes, which, on the one hand, you always want to just roleplay anyway, and nobody's really overpowered against another, but when push comes to shove, it seemed like that was the general consensus, was the Ranger was a little underpowered compared to the rest. So instead of giving us a Ranger subclass, it just kind of provided some extra spells that were more fairy themed. So that one is also unfortunately a little disappointing. I can see the reasoning behind it, where they're like, hey, we weren't sure what to do with the Ranger because the Ranger's kind of under construction right now, but I would have preferred just do something and, maybe make your Ranger a little overpowered and then mention the fact that, hey, if this gets changed, then you can change things along. I would have really liked to see a fun Ranger archetype here, but I don't necessarily knock it for that so much as so I just think the subclasses in general are just not terribly exciting, and unfortunately they take up a lot of room. The Fey Bloodline for the Sorcerer's Origin works pretty well, giving you some nice themed spells, specifically just themed to the courts, which is nice. It's not just fairy themed, but actually like Summer Court or Winter Court and all that shit is very, very cool. Let's move on to the Jabberwock for Warlock. That was actually interesting. That turns you into a more monstrous form. from the classic Through the Looking Glass of the Jabberwock poem. You can actually grow like spectral fangs and deal psychic damage or something, which is kind of nuts. Magic items is pretty neat because they're actually specifically drawn from real like folklore, which is neat, really nifty. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce a lot of these because they are some old ass Celtic words. And they come with the curses, which are also from those actual stories, which is really neat. There's a whole legacy weapon that actually it's a really powerful artifact, but when you use it, you are cursed with essentially this super form of rage that your whole body transforms into this like hideous ogre, and you get some benefits, but you also just have to keep on attacking. So it kind of turns you into a raging barbarian at that point. There's a lot of just everything is obviously very, very heavily themed and tied to that Fey theme. You know, cold iron, it always does more damage against fairies, so that you can just have flavor any weapon as a cold iron weapon. And some of these are going to be only useful for campaigns that involved in the Feywild, but others just could be a nice item that you find, like some kind of legendary artifact that would then tie into a fairy campaign. So that could like lead you into that campaign, which would be pretty fun. Legacy items is something I really want to mention specifically that I thought is an amazing idea that feels very video gamey but works really well. I don't know if I've ever seen this before. I'm sure somebody's come up with it. I don't know if I can credit the author with coming up with this entire concept. If they did, then that's amazing. But these are essentially magic, really, really rare, powerful magic items that level up. They literally gain new abilities as you grow in power or, unlock different things. Let's see. Legacy weapons grow in power as the wielder gains experience, discovers the history of the item they wield, and finds ways to unlock the weapon's true potential. So this could be part of a quest line, for example, which would be really neat. Or you go back to the person that forged the weapon and find out more. So, for example, you could introduce Excalibur as an item early in a campaign, and then they actually unlock the item's true potential as you get further in the campaign. I think that's a really, really fun, neat idea, especially with the way D&D 5th edition is balanced, that it's not really loot-based, for better or for worse, compared to other previous editions. So players end up getting just less loot overall. So if you get, so you end up, those few items you get are really precious. And if you get one that becomes such a cool flavored item, that's like you're like almost tied to that item, and then it grows in power, so you want to continue using that item instead of just replacing it with whatever next new item you get. That's a really, really neat idea, and there are some very, very cool ideas and weapons in here that I absolutely just loved. I'm not going to go through because they're huge. It's like they start off with a +1 bonus, and they could eventually get to like a +3 bonus, and they get all these other really, really cool benefits. So just a really, really neat idea. And again, the design notes even says what all they're from. The Gaybolg is that spear I mentioned that kind of turns you into a raging barbarian, one of those famous weapons from Irish mythology, and is closely tied to the legends of Cuchulainn, which very, very cool. It's an entire page dedicated to this legendary artifact. So I was very, very impressed. Usually when magic items are given as part of supplements, they're like the DM's Guild items, where they're just a paragraph or two, and that's still fine, but I was really blown away with how much detail and information is given for all of these items. You do have a few of the paragraph-only items up here. Certainly, there's 2 or 3 pages of those, maybe more than that. But then you get these giant artifacts, which are just page-long, giant legacy rare weapons, which are complete campaign changers. And I love the idea specifically of weapons that gain power either as players level up or as what I would tie it to, and obviously leveling up as part of the campaign going on, is literally making that part of quests. So like if you go on this quest and you complete the next step of it, then you can unlock the weapon's next power level, which I think is a really, really neat idea, and I love that a lot. And the final chapter, I think this is the final chapter, is the Bestiary, which includes the stat blocks for pretty much all the characters who were mentioned early on. A lot of the Queen of Summer and Baba Yaga, this evil old witch. A lot of them are giant CR 20+ creatures that most of us are never going to see or use, frankly. It's still fun to see them. It's fun to see how the authors have translated these characters who are so, just godlike, powerful creatures from mythology, how do they actually translate into D&D? And for the most part, it's pretty cool. This Balar is like this giant cyclops with this eye that slowly opens, and literally it like gains charges and opens throughout each round. And once it fully opens, it's just fucking bananas of a cone of death. But that's a neat concept for a boss fight, is this extra thing you have to keep track of, and he's like, he can point his laser cone of terror at wherever he wants to on his action, which is neat. So it's nice to see all these creatures here. Most of them you're probably not honestly going to use because they are extremely powerful. There are a few that are lower levels. Let's see, well, Banshees. I thought Banshees are in the player handbook. I guess maybe I could have sworn they are. This is a slightly different flavored Banshee, I think. Fey Panther, which I don't know how that's slightly different than a Displacer Beast, I suppose. Feywild is weird. Like, Feywild is mostly just, animals that are just fairy, so you could easily just replace any animal with a fairy version and use that stat block from the monster manual. It's just these specific characters. So in terms of fleshing out a actual Feywild campaign, I'm not sure what you could do with it, and I mean, this is probably the best thing you could do, which is just provide stat blocks for all of the major NPCs, which are huge end the campaign boss fights, and then I would just, flavor a few animals as being fairy, and that's kind of part of the Feywild. There's not really much there, but they do draw from a lot of fun mythology. There's Taliesin, who I believe, is that from King Arthur's myth? Welsh mythology. Yeah, Bard in King Arthur's court. It's so much fun how all of these things are drawn from real myths. Like, I feel smarter and more cultured from actually reading this supplement, which is really impressive. It's not just making shit up from previous D&D editions, although that's obviously part of it, but it is drawn from real life mythologies, which is really neat, especially if any of your players are well versed. If they're a nerd about Irish mythology or King Arthur legends, Arthurian legends and all those. If they're really into that stuff, I think they will get a real kick out of any one of these like magical items or creatures and things, which is really, really fun. Let's do my pros and cons for Myrddin's Guide to Fairy. Pro. Provides detailed information on Fey NPCs and stat blocks, as well as new Fey races, fairy-themed subclasses, and magic items of the Feywild. There is a lot of stuff here. It's really almost like a Xanathar's level in terms of just supplement for all of those things that are fairy-related. Pro, fairy backgrounds and characters are drawn from past D&D editions, as well as classic mythology stories such as Irish myths, King Arthur, and William Shakespeare. I was really impressed with how these things are very much drawn from our real-life myths as well as past D&D editions to provide all of that information, and just it's a fun read, and also it's frankly a very knowledgeable read, just outside of even using it for D&D. It's really fun. Pro, I really like the legacy items. Legacy items that unlock new abilities as you level up are a fantastic concept, and frankly, deserves its own D&D supplement. Give me a D&D supplement that's literally, specifically, magic items that are designed to scale as players go, and they can be part of a side quest that player can go on. I think that's a really, really neat idea. I would love to see an entire DM's Guild supplement just based on that. My only con is the subclasses. I appreciate having all that information here. I think that's appropriate to have for an all-in-one guide to Fairy. But they end up being the least interesting part of the guide. A lot of it is just slightly rethemed versions of things that are in the player's handbook. And I do think that the subclasses already had the best Fairy stuff beforehand. So, the Warlock of the Archfey and all those were already like pretty solid stuff to where they really didn't need any more. So I don't want to knock it for giving me that information, but it just ended up being the weakest part of the book, and also unfortunately ended up taking up the most amount of room in the book. So the final verdict, Myrddin's Guide to Fairy is an effective all-in-one supplement with fairy-themed races, subclasses, magic items, and detailed NPCs of the Feywild. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work either through affiliate links for the DMs Guild or at patreon.com/roguewatson, or both. And you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.